Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks Rookie Faceoff tournament that is now just a couple of days away, but it was a few days ago in which the Sharks announced their roster for this 3-game stretch. Now, not every single top prospect is here for San Jose. For instance, the 33rd overall pick from this past year's draft, Igor Chernyshov, is missing. This is because he is injured, and I believe it was announced just a couple of weeks ago that he had to go through a surgery to repair something in his shoulder. I imagine if he was healthy, he would have been a full participant in this tournament. Other players missing, like Leo Selin-Wallenius and Matthias Havlet, are likely to be gearing up for the beginning of the SHL season. That starts just a few days after this tournament concludes, so it's very much makes sense that they wouldn't want to make the trek to North America to then have to make the trek all the way back to Sweden for this all-important SHL season for themselves. But there are still a lot of big names on the roster for San Jose, a lot of very interesting players to watch. I won't be discussing every single player. That would end up being a pretty long video, and there are a few players who just, aren't necessarily going to pique a lot of interests. For instance, many tryout players for the San Jose Sharks who aren't even technically in the organization. Others who were drafted like in the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th round, players like Nate Miskey or Carson Wetch, who are still somewhat intriguing prospects in the system for San Jose, maybe a few years down the line. But in the immediate future, this next season, the year after that, they're likely not going to be making much of an impact. So instead, I have narrowed it down to these 10 players to keep an eye on who are likely to be a lot more exciting to watch. And we start off, of course, with Macklin Celebrini, the biggest name here for San Jose, and perhaps one of, if not the biggest name around the league during this time period as the first overall pick from this past year's draft. Now, the expectations for Celebrini are sky high. This is actually his first real stint in a San Jose Sharks jersey. Sure, we saw him a couple of months ago at the Sharks development camp, but that was such a lax environment that you really couldn't pull many, if any, conclusions from it. But there are some pretty huge shoes for Celebrini to fill. Last year, we look at Connor Bedard, the first overall pick from that season, his first appearance in the Rookie Faceoff tournament. He scored a hat trick. Even Adam Fantilli, the 3rd overall pick, also scored a hat trick in his first appearance. So Macklin Celebrini, everyone is going to be looking at what he's actually going to be able to do, and us Sharks fans, of course, are hoping for the best. Next, we get to Will Smith. Now, Smith is in a pretty interesting spot going into this Rookie Faceoff tournament where I'm honestly not sure how much his performance that he puts up, at least from an offensive standpoint, is actually going to shift what the San Jose Sharks view in him as a player. For instance, if the Sharks and Warsofsky have him penciled into like a 3rd line to start the season and he comes out and puts up like 6 points in 3 games, is that really going to move the needle enough to put him up into the top 6? Probably not. This is because we already really know what Smith is capable of from an offensive perspective when he plays in these types of games, in these types of situations. Over these last couple of years in the NCAA and the US NDP, he has skated circles around like 99% of the players who have been on the ice with him at his similar age group. For Smith, that's not really going to be what moves the needle, like I said. What you would maybe want to see more so from him is actually trying to put into practice what he has hopefully learned over this past offseason into adjusting his game into a more well-rounded 200-foot sense. We already know he can put up the points to match with the best of them when it comes to rookies, but to actually be responsible enough to get that increased ice time at the NHL level, that's what you're definitely going to be watching for. Obviously, if he comes out and scores like 10 points in 3 games, it's going to be hard to justify that that's not an outstanding performance that could move him up in the depth charts. But otherwise, you're really looking for more of a complete game from Will Smith to have him really assert himself as a top 6 forward going into the season next year. Then we get to Quentin Musty. I just talked about how this Rookie Faceoff tournament might not be extremely important for Smith. For Musty, on the other hand, it is quite the opposite. This is because it's in a very interesting situation for Musty this year, where either he makes it to the NHL, which is of course his ultimate goal, or he's forced to head back to the OHL, where he has already shown to be an incredibly dominant player. There isn't necessarily a lot more that he can learn at the OHL level, but because of the rules, there isn't actually this middle ground that he could land on. He cannot go to the AHL next season until his junior season is finished. And so for Musty, if he truly wants to be able to make it to the NHL, which is a dream that is seemingly quite far out of reach, it needs to start immediately, and it needs to start with the Rookie Faceoff tournament. putting up points, but also showing himself as a reliable player, like I talked about with Will Smith, is going to be imperative to start to work his way up the depth charts for the San Jose Sharks, because they added so many new forwards to this roster during the offseason that there are even a few players on the outside looking in, like a Klim Kostin or a Thomas Bordeleau, who are still above Musty, who still have priority over him as a player, that Musty will have to leapfrog a bunch of guys, probably like half a dozen players, to actually be able to get a chance at the NHL, to even just get a 9-game stint, to not burn a year off of his entry-level contract, the chance of playing in the regular season in the NHL. He'll have to be exceptionally good through this tournament and through preseason. We shall see if it can start on the right foot. He'll get some opportunities with both Celebrini and Smith, I imagine, throughout the tournament, so that'll certainly help out his cause, but definitely the player to keep an eye on. Next, we have Casper Halttunen. Now, unlike Musty, he does have that middle ground to land on. He has the opportunity to play in the AHL if he is capable of it, and if the Sharks so choose to have him go there. Now, I'm not sure how much this Rookie Faceoff tournament is actually going to be impactful for deciding whether or not Halttunen can hang around. For Halttunen, for these young players to actually make the jump to the professional level, you really want to be able to see what they are able to do against the more experienced players, the players who are more physically developed, those who have been involved in the professional play for the last 5 years, the last 10 years, the last 15 years perhaps as well. That's really where you want to see them in action. So Halttunen going up against teenagers like he will again in the OHL, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, maybe 20-year-olds, is not really going to be the thing that is the telltale sign of if he is actually fully ready, and that's likely more so to come through the preseason game or two that he's going to end up getting. Having said that, the Rookie Faceoff tournament is still an opportunity for him to prove himself capable. He'll likely, like with Musty, get some chances with Celebrini and Smith as his centermen, which is going to help inflate his point total. And of course, it's always going to look better if you're putting up 4 or 5 points in 3 games compared to if you're putting up 0 points over that same time frame. Then we move on to Filip Bystedt. Now, unlike the last couple of players I mentioned, his future with this organization is really not in flux at all. He's going to be starting the season with the San Jose Barracuda, and it's very likely he finishes the season as well. Perhaps he could get 1 or 2 NHL games if he's playing that well near the end of the season, but more likely than not, he spends pretty much the entire year with the San Jose Barracuda. That is not to say, however, that this Rookie Faceoff tournament is not important for him. In fact, it is actually quite important. The reason for that is that when he was originally drafted back in 2022, Filip Bystedt had immediately a jump up to one of the Sharks' top prospects. It was, for the reason that they didn't really have that many prospects in their system at the time, not so much an indication of how hyped up he was as a player, but still he was like a top 3, maybe top 5 at the very least. Now with the selections that they have made over these last couple of years, adding Celebrini and Smith and Dickinson and Chernyshov and all these guys, Bystedt is now sort of like on the lower half of the top 10 prospects for the San Jose Sharks. So this Rookie Faceoff tournament could be an opportunity for him to show that he is still a capable prospect, that he still has a good amount of potential, that he could still become something for this franchise over the next year or two. So we shall see if he's actually able to sort of plant his flag in the ground and show that I'm still here, or if he'll continue to fall down the wayside, with another likely high pick coming this next offseason for the San Jose Sharks. For Bystedt, you want to try and not get sort of pulled away from those top names. Then we have Ethan Cardwell, who is a veteran of the Rookie Faceoff tournaments. While some players might be playing in their first or maybe second, he's actually participating in his 4th straight Rookie Faceoff tournament for the San Jose Sharks. So he may act as a bit more of like a veteran presence for some of these younger guys. If he ends up playing some time with players like Celebrini and Smith on his line, he could almost be like a mentor for them to help them get through this sort of new environment that they are currently finding themselves in. In terms of Cardwell as an actual prospect, he obviously doesn't carry that same level of hype as some of the other names I've already talked about, these first rounders or high second rounders in the case of Halttunen. Cardwell being a fourth rounder from a few years ago. He has had to undergo the sort of slow and stable and steady path towards the NHL. He spent a few years extra in the OHL, overagers season, those types of things. Made his jump to the professional level this past season where he was actually quite good, one of the highest scorers for the Barracuda this past year. In fact, was actually one of the highest scorers amongst all AHL rookies around that entire league. I actually thought he'd end up getting his first career NHL game last season near the end of it, considering there really wasn't much competition on the Sharks roster. It just didn't end up happening for whatever reason. That could then end up being in the cards for him next year as long as his performance does hold up. But if he continues on this strong upward trajectory, I don't really see any reason for why Cardwell might not be able to make an NHL debut, maybe as early as this season, but perhaps into the next year as well, as sort of a bottom six type of guy. He's someone who I actually really like in the Sharks organization at this point. And then the final forward to talk about here is Colin Graf, the only forward that I'm going to be talking about who actually has played NHL games, was signed out of the NCAA near the end of last season and played a few games for the San Jose Sharks, likely a stipulation of the contract actually being signed with San Jose. And while, the few games he played were not terrible, they definitely didn't catch my eye, and they definitely weren't all that impressive. So much so that with all of the additions that the Sharks have made this past offseason, I feel as though Colin Graf is much more on the outside looking into the Sharks roster, and I really haven't factored him in all that much when I've decided my predictions for what the Sharks forward lines will actually look like. It seems much more likely that Colin Graf will start the year in the AHL. Now, this Rookie Faceoff tournament could be an opportunity to try and build up that stock slightly more. I imagine when Graf originally signed with San Jose, it was with the idea in his mind that he would have some real big opportunities of actually being able to play in the NHL, and not just for those immediate few games after being signed, but also into the future for them. Maybe he wasn't expecting the amount of signings that the Sharks actually ended up making this offseason, but for him, it's definitely going to be a tough climb, and with him likely, as with many of the other players I've already talked about, getting some chances with Celebrini and Smith, that'll be an opportunity to show himself capable with those NHL games under his belt. He also is sort of one of the more experienced players here, kind of like what I said with Ethan Cardwell, so we will see what he is capable of. Then we move on to a few defensemen, and the first one is, of course, Sam Dickinson, a bit of a controversial player amongst Sharks prospects, not because of anything he has done, but instead who he could have been. When the Sharks were selecting at 11th overall, they had the selection either of Sam Dickinson or Zeev Buium, and there were a ton of Sharks fans who really wanted to land Zeev Buium as their choice, but instead Mike Grier went with the seemingly safer 6'3" big defenseman in Sam Dickinson, and so there is a lot of expectations on his shoulder to really to convince Sharks fans that this was the correct choice. Now, at the development camp scrimmage, Dickinson was anything but impressive, but of course, as I mentioned, you can't really draw too many conclusions from it. This Rookie Faceoff tournament will be the first time we'll actually see what Dickinson can actually do from a defensive standpoint, because now he can actually raise that level of play since you're going up against other teams' prospects, so you can be a bit more physical in that regard. And also from an offensive perspective as well, he's likely going to be getting a decent amount of minutes here, maybe one of the, if not the most high-played defensemen at this tournament for the San Jose Sharks, and hopefully he can put up a good performance as he heads into the preseason and likely returning back to the London Knights this year. Then we get to Luca Cagnoni, who's in a very similar position as Casper Halttunen in the sense that he has the ability to play in the AHL this season, but as well, like with Halttunen, it's not really going to be the Rookie Faceoff tournament that makes the big difference for him, but instead how he is able to do through the likely 1 or 2 preseason games he shall get. Can he hang around with the increased size that you are likely to find at the professional level? But again, like with Halttunen, this is still a Rookie Faceoff tournament where he can still show if he is capable of hanging around at the very least with his own peers, players around his own age, if he's able to actually put up a decent amount of points like he was able to do when he was playing in the WHL. And then the final defenseman to talk about is Shakir Mukhamadullin. Like with Graf in the forwards, Mukhamadullin is the only defenseman I'm talking about who has actually played NHL games as well. He got 3 games near the middle part of last season. Now, he is someone who has kind of fallen out of favor with a lot of people. When I've seen people rating San Jose Sharks prospects, Mukhamadullin has found himself on the outside looking in to the Sharks top 10 for whatever reason. Honestly, I don't see much of a reason for that, considering he was already a borderline NHLer this past year, and he may very well be able to participate this season as well, depending on how things work out. If the Sharks roster is fully healthy, it's going to be difficult to break in, because down the left side they'll have Ferraro, Wallman, and Thrun, and then down the right side they'll have Ceci, Ruta, and Benning. But Benning's future with the Sharks is a bit up in the air. He missed the majority of last season due to injury. We don't know how well he'll actually be able to come back, if he's even fully healthy to do so, at which point the decision then ends up being between Mukhamadullin and Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and to me that seems like a pretty easy decision. I would choose Mukhamadullin over Marc-Edouard Vlasic any day. In fact, I'd probably choose like an orange traffic cone over Marc-Edouard Vlasic at least 50% of the time. And so it is possible that Mukhamadullin could have a relatively consistent spot in the Sharks roster, but at the same time I could see him anywhere fluctuating between like 0 to 40 plus games this next season. But this rookie face-off tournament here, as one of the more experienced players on the back end for the San Jose Sharks, is definitely going to be a chance to at least get a bit of stock back. Like I said, some people have lost a bit of faith into him as a Sharks prospect, and hopefully he can actually put up a good performance over the likely 2 to 3 games that he shall get. We shall see what he's able to do. But that will do it for this roster preview. Like I said, the tournament is just a few days away, and it's likely to be a very, very exciting one. These last few years for the San Jose Sharks, they've had like a couple of players that have been fun to watch, like Eklund or Bordelot, but this is a year where there's like 5 to 10, if you really want to count all 10 of these players, that are actually quite cool to watch. And the Sharks should obviously find a lot of success here over this 3-game tournament. They could easily go 3-0, though I don't really know the power of some of the other rosters around the other teams participating here, but this is probably one of the best, considering they have one of the best prospect pools in the league. Class dismissed.